Money laundering used to mean duffel bags of cash, shady nightclubs, and crooked accountants. But today the game has changed. Cartels don't just move drugs anymore, they move data. They don't just wash bills, they wash code. In this video, we're going to follow that shift step by step. From the old school tricks of the street to the rise of crypto, to the strange new world of digital mixers and tumblers. We'll look at how these systems work in principle, the people who try to use them, and the law enforcement cat and mouse chase that follows. And most importantly, we'll ask, what's the real cost of this new laundry? Who wins, who loses, and who's left behind? So settle in. This is Crypto, Cartels, and Mixers, the new laundry. Under the flickering neon sign of a border town cantina, the old rules of money still applied. Cash was king, and everyone knew that money was only as useful as it was invisible. For decades, cartels perfected their craft not just in trafficking narcotics, but in laundering the immense rivers of currency that followed. In dimly lit offices, accountants shuffled ledgers and storefronts with barely any customers declared suspiciously high revenues. A car wash with 3 daily clients claimed to make thousands. A nightclub, open twice a week, seemed to never run dry of paying patrons. Behind it all, couriers carried thick envelopes across checkpoints, hiding bundles in car doors or simply walking across with enough nerve to make a fortune look like a paycheck. It was a dangerous game, but it worked. The world has always been built on trust and perception. When a bank official saw deposits coming from what looked like a legitimate business, the scrutiny often ended there. The fiction was convincing enough. Cartels were not simply violent organizations. They were also corporations, hiring specialists who understood both crime and compliance. The laundries they ran were as vital as the smuggling routes themselves. After all, what use was $1 billion in street cash if it could not be spent? Families needed homes, politicians demanded bribes, and new shipments required clean capital. Dirty money had to breathe in clean air before it could live. But by the late 2000s, cracks in this system began to show. Governments tightened regulations, banks faced heavier penalties, and international agencies grew sharper teeth. Anti-money laundering units demanded more documentation, flagged suspicious transfers, and imposed stricter thresholds for cash deposits. Informants within the very financial systems cartels relied on began feeding details to law enforcement. What was once a relatively reliable chain of corruption and concealment began to fracture. The physical act of moving billions in currency also became a liability. Warehouses stacked with bills were fire hazards and legal liabilities. Cash was too heavy, too visible, and too dangerous. The cartels needed a new laundry, something lighter, faster, and far more elusive. Technology answered their call, though not by design. Bitcoin appeared in 2009 as a promise of independence, a digital currency unbound by governments and banks. Its early adopters were dreamers, libertarians, and coders who saw a chance to reshape the world of finance. But in the shadows, others took notice. Cartels recognized that this strange new money wasn't just currency. It was potential camouflage, pseudonymity, instant cross-border transfers, and the ability to move value without physical presence offered an irresistible temptation. The same qualities that inspired utopian ideals could also fuel criminal innovation. At first, the adoption was clumsy. Operators who barely understood digital wallets fumbled with keys, lost millions in mistakes, or simply had their coins stolen. But over time, The criminal accountants adapted. They didn't need to understand every line of code, only the promise it carried. The same men who once handed off bags of cash now handed off flash drives or scrawled alphanumeric strings onto slips of paper. Instead of hiring drivers to cross checkpoints, they hired tech fixers to set up wallets, exchanges, and accounts across jurisdictions. The logistics of laundering shifted from highways to fiber optic cables. Yet even in this digital frontier, the goal remained unchanged: obscure the origin of dirty money until it could emerge as clean. Bitcoin, though powerful, was not entirely anonymous. Every transaction left a trace on its public ledger, a blockchain that could be followed like digital footprints in fresh snow. Criminals quickly realized that simply moving coins was not enough. Investigators could still track flows with patience and skill. What was needed was distortion, something to blur the trail until it became meaningless. That is where mixers came into play. A mixer, in simple terms, is like throwing different colors of paint into a bucket and stirring until no one can tell what shade came from where. Coins from many sources are pooled together, jumbled, and then redistributed, often in uneven amounts and at different times. The result is a puzzle. The funds reappear, but the connections between original owner and final recipient are obscured. To law enforcement, the chain becomes a maze with too many doors and no clear map. To the cartels, it is a digital washing machine spinning dirty funds until they emerge cleaner. And no, but mixers are not foolproof. They introduce risk, both of theft and exposure. Some are operated by opportunists who vanish with deposits, leaving desperate criminals scrambling. Others are traps, set up by law enforcement or compromised through infiltration. Still, the allure of such services was too strong for organizations already accustomed to risk. Just as they once entrusted couriers with millions stuffed into car panels, they began entrusting anonymous websites with millions in cryptocurrency, hoping the spin cycle would leave them safer on the other side. The transition from cash to code was not merely practical. It reshaped the very psychology of laundering. No longer tied to geography, cartels could wash money while sitting thousands of miles away. Transactions that once required entire networks of couriers and complicit bankers could now occur with a few keystrokes. The scale was breathtaking, and the velocity unmatched. Where once laundering required patience, digital laundering allowed near-instant shifts, layering and obscuring at a pace no traditional investigator could match without specialized tools. And yet, beneath the shine of digital efficiency, the same old truths remained. Every innovation carried its countermeasure. As mixers grew popular, so too did blockchain analysis firms. Governments poured resources into tracing flows, building new partnerships with exchanges, and devising methods to pierce the digital fog. Arrests followed, indictments multiplied, and some mixers fell. Their operators exposed and dragged into courtrooms. The cat-and-mouse game endured, simply played on a new field with new pieces. For the cartels, this was only the beginning. Old laundering methods never disappeared. They evolved. Cash businesses still flourished, offshore accounts still existed, and corrupt officials still opened doors. But now, the arsenal included crypto, mixers, and digital brokers. Together they formed a new hybrid system, one that was less visible to the naked eye, but no less real in impact. The laundries were no longer just car washes and nightclubs. They were code servers and the invisible hum of data passing silently through wires across the globe. And while the men at the top embraced this new laundry, the ones at the bottom still paid the cost. Small couriers, unwitting mules, and desperate exchangers carried the highest risk, often without the reward. Just as in the days of physical cash, the lowest links in the chain bore the brunt of law enforcement while the masterminds remained insulated. The more things changed, the more they stayed the same. In this evolution from mules to mixers, the cartels had not rewritten the rules. They had only upgraded the tools. He learned to work at night because the night hid mistakes. The courier's hands moved with the slow efficiency of someone who had done the same task long enough to make it ritual: fold, slide, seal, stack. Envelopes the size of ordinary mail, unremarkable except for the way they multiplied across his kitchen table. Outside, a street lamp hummed. Inside, a cheap clock stuttered toward dawn. He told himself this was temporary. A few runs and the family would breathe easier, but temporary stretched into months, and months into a life measured in small bills and constant anxiety. The job paid more than his daytime deliveries, but came with a new vocabulary of risk. Collection, drop, confirm. Words that sounded mundane in a messenger app, but carried consequences if misread or disobeyed. When he wasn't counting envelopes, his head filled with images of machines he didn't understand. A contact had shown him a grainy screenshot once, rows of blinking server racks and lines of code. "It's just tech," the contact said. "You move the boxes, they move the money." The courier had nodded, not because he grasped the mechanics, but because it simplified fear into something someone else controlled. In practice, control proved fragile. The human chain recruiters, middlemen, exchange clerks contained more leaks than armor. People get greedy, sloppy, or caught. Promises of anonymity and clean funds dispersed like smoke when a username reappeared in a screenshot or a phone pinged in a wrong country. Across oceans, in a windowless room cooled to a precise degree, servers hummed like a sleeping animal. Racks bathed in blue LEDs hosted software designed to do one thing: hide. Not by removing records that was impossible in many cryptocurrency systems, but by increasing the number of hands any investigator would have to hold to follow a coin's journey. The software operators called themselves necessary intermediaries. They insisted they were providing privacy, the same way a lawyer provides counsel or a locksmith offers discretion. To the cartel accountants, they were tools expensive, risky, but effective enough to frustrate casual tracing. To investigators, they were obfuscation services that weaponized the ideals of privacy for profit. The industry that grew around digital laundering was layered and oddly corporate. At the top sat the architects, developers and infrastructure rental operators who understood how to stitch systems across borders, rent server space where law enforcement oversight was minimal, and market services with glossy, trust-building language. Below them, a middle layer of brokers and exchangers connected the analog and the digital. These brokers were fluent in both worlds. They knew how to translate a pile of cash into a wallet address and how to move coins into fiat without triggering alarms. And beneath them, the human instruments couriers, cash mule rings, small-time exchangers performed the ugly, visible work that could be investigated and punished while the architects remained insulated. This structure produced economies of scale. A single mixing service could accept deposits from dozens of sources, aggregate them into pools, and then distribute outputs in ways that deliberately blurred timing and amounts. The result was not magic, but mathematics. More noise in the ledger, more plausible deniability. The larger and more popular a service became, the more valuable it was to criminal networks, because a greater pool meant greater dilution. Yet popularity also attracted attention. Exchange platforms started flagging suspicious patterns. Blockchain analytics firms refined algorithms, learning to recognize the fingerprints of laundering despite the noise. Servers once advertised as untraceable became, in practice, merely harder to trace. As the system matured, new roles emerged that never existed in the days of suitcases and nightclubs. Compliance hunters worked for legitimate exchanges but moonlighted as intelligence brokers, quietly selling leads. Technology fixers offered patches and backdoors to those who could pay, presenting their work as code optimization or security consultation. Some fixers were cynical idealists who believed in digital privacy for its own sake. Others offered their talents to cartels for reasons as old as power money, status, self-preservation. Many came from countries where state compensation was weak and legal enforcement patchy, so the moral calculus was pragmatic. A lucrative contract today could feed a family for a year. Victims of this economy were not only the erstwhile couriers, small-time exchangers, the kids who accepted cash to deposit into a linked account for a cut, were often the first to be prosecuted. They understood currency, but not the architecture protecting the higher tiers. When a law enforcement sweep came, it hit the visible nodes, the ones with addresses, phones, and public faces. The figures who designed the laundering strategies, who owned server space in jurisdictions with weak extradition treaties, were hard to touch. This asymmetric risk distribution shaped recruitment. Cartels preferred to staff outward-facing roles with expendable labor, keeping command and design fractured and insulated. Law enforcement, meanwhile, adapted in its own way. Specialized units formed, staffed by data scientists and investigators who could speak both legal and technical languages. They cultivated relationships with exchanges, manufactured legal pressure, and pursued court orders to seize server space or freeze funds. When that proved insufficient, they leaned on diplomacy, nudging foreign governments to cooperate. Public cases, the takedown of a major mixer, the indictment of a broker, were often surgical. An intelligence-led operation that combined digital forensics, human sources, and cross-border legal muscle. Each successful disruption left a vacuum and inevitably spawned new ingenuity. The cycle of innovation and countermeasure became a grim rhythm. Beyond the practicalities of detection and enforcement lay a subtler shift, the normalization of certain tools in gray markets. Privacy software, encrypted messaging, and digital cash that once existed for idealistic reasons now had dual lives. A technologist might build a privacy protocol to protect dissidents, and the same protocol might be adopted by a cartel accountant to hide illicit profits. This dual use posed ethical dilemmas that were hard to resolve. Regulators could clamp down, but heavy-handed rules risked sweeping up legitimate users. Tech companies could add friction to disrupt abuse, but each added check also eroded anonymity for those with valid reasons to remain private. The courier, who had once been a small cog in a physical chain, found himself unknowingly embedded in a complex digital ecosystem that extended far beyond his understanding. His nightly runs were now one of many inputs into a system that mashed coins into a pool, then redistributed them into accounts he would never see. Occasionally, he would receive a message, confirm drop, all okay. It was short, clinical, and stripped of context. The lack of face-to-face contact reduced empathy and made betrayal easier. When arrests came, they were as likely to arrive through a pings on a device as through a stakeout. What had begun as an innovation promising financial freedom for some had evolved into a battleground. Tools meant to empower could, in the wrong hands, empower the worst impulses. The new laundry was efficient and elegant in its own cold way, but it also created a buffer that let harm ripple further and faster. The systems had made laundering less visible to casual observers, but more complex to untangle for those trying to hold anyone accountable. In the glow of server lights and under the quiet scratch of envelopes, the human cost remained. People coerced, communities destabilized, and legal systems strained by technologies designed for a different era. The players changed, the methods matured, and yet the moral ledger demanded the same reckoning. Innovation without stewardship often benefits those willing to flout the rules. The history of laundering has always been less about money itself and more about disguise. Long before anyone typed a wallet address into a computer or watched colored lines glow across a blockchain, there were envelopes, safes, and ledgers written in neat, anonymous hands. The challenge was constant. How to make ill-gotten gains look ordinary, how to turn the proceeds of crime into assets that could survive the scrutiny of banks, governments, or tax collectors. The solutions varied by era, but the logic remained timeless. Money, like water, seeks channels that hide its source. In the early decades of the 20th century, organized crime in America and Europe leaned heavily on cash businesses. Prohibition gave rise to bootleggers who suddenly had more paper currency than they could possibly spend openly. To legitimize this river of bills, crime syndicates purchased laundromats, diners, and small theaters. The term money laundering itself may not have been coined in those exact years, but the metaphor was accurate. Dirty cash, fed through coin-operated washers, came out the other side wrapped in the scent of soap and legitimacy. These businesses had low costs, high turnover, and little oversight, making them perfect camouflage. By the mid-century, cartels and syndicates grew more sophisticated. Shell companies began to multiply, paper entities that existed on record but not in reality. A name and an address, sometimes nothing more than a mailbox in Panama, the Cayman Islands, or Switzerland, could represent entire networks of accounts. Funds flowed in and out, obscured by layers of legal paperwork and offshore secrecy. Lawyers and accountants became as crucial as enforcers and smugglers. Some were fully complicit, others willfully blind. To outsiders, the money appeared as legitimate corporate profit. To insiders, it was the lifeblood of criminal empires. Cash mules, meanwhile, carried the burden at the human level. Men and women, often paid modestly, crossed borders with stacks of bills strapped to their bodies or hidden in luggage. Some were seasoned operators who knew the signals and routes. Others were coerced, told it was a harmless errand. Airports and checkpoints became theaters of risk, with customs officers serving as the final obstacle between the mule and a successful drop. The method was crude but effective. A single mule might move tens of thousands in one trip. A coordinated network could channel millions in a matter of weeks. Mixing cash through legitimate businesses formed the backbone of laundering for decades. Restaurants that never closed, nightclubs that charged inflated cover fees, taxi companies with phantom rides, all of these offered excuses for large sums of money to appear in bank accounts without triggering suspicion. A nightclub owner could claim a packed weekend, a restaurant could exaggerate its turnover, and the bank teller would dutifully accept the deposit slip. In communities where oversight was lax or corruption endemic, no one asked too many questions. The brilliance of old-school laundering was not in technology, but in theater. It relied on creating convincing illusions, on blending dirty cash into the ordinary churn of commerce. The cash register ringing, the bartender counting tips, the car wash owner smiling at his spotless sedans, these were performances, and the audience was regulators and bankers who preferred not to look too closely. As long as the show was convincing, the money was safe. Yet every act left vulnerabilities. Cash couriers could be arrested. Banks grew more attentive as regulators introduced reporting requirements for deposits above certain thresholds. Shell companies drew suspicion if they had no staff, no premises, and no real trade. Over time, governments began to coordinate internationally, developing anti-money laundering frameworks and blacklists. The art of hiding money was still possible, but it required greater effort and greater risk. Some cartels leaned heavily on trade-based laundering, manipulating invoices for imports and exports. A container of coffee beans might be overvalued on paper, justifying a massive transfer of funds that in reality bore no relation to the cargo inside. Conversely, undervaluing shipments allowed profits to be shifted overseas with little tax or scrutiny. This technique required logistics, shipping partners, and cooperative customs officials, but it opened vast new channels. Criminal organizations with global supply chains found this method particularly effective, weaving illicit funds into the fabric of legitimate trade. Even with these evolutions, the sheer volume of physical cash created headaches. Storing millions in bills demanded warehouses, fireproof safes, and constant guards. In some countries, entire rooms were discovered stacked wall to wall with currency, a dragon's hoard of paper that could not be spent without risk. Fire, mold, and theft added to the danger. Wealth that could not move was wealth that lost its meaning. Criminal leaders pressured their financial operatives to find faster, safer laundries. Law enforcement learned to look for anomalies. Why was a small-town car wash reporting profits larger than a chain with dozens of outlets? Why did a nightclub with sparse attendance claim to sell out every night? The numbers betrayed the illusion. Investigators also traced patterns of cash deposits, structuring the practice of breaking up large sums into smaller, less suspicious deposits made at different banks. Known as smurfing, this technique relied on armies of low-level operatives making frequent visits, each transaction small enough to escape automatic reporting, but in aggregate representing millions. As the 20th century closed, laundering had become an arms race. Criminals innovated, regulators responded, shell companies shifted jurisdictions. Cash smuggling routes adapted to Border Patrol strategies. Trade-based schemes grew ever more elaborate, but the foundations remained the same. Conceal the origin, integrate funds into legitimate systems, and enjoy the profits without scrutiny. The tools were physical, bureaucratic, and psychological. The laundries were places you could walk into: a bar, a factory, an office tower in an offshore capital. To understand the leap into crypto, it is essential to see these old methods not as primitive, but as proof of adaptability. Each innovation in crime was matched by innovation in oversight, and each crackdown spurred a new technique. What the digital era offered was not a radical break from the past, but the next stage in an evolutionary chain. Instead of mules with envelopes, there would be transfers across invisible networks. Instead of shell companies in island nations, there would be anonymous wallets in cyberspace. Instead of trade invoices, there would be mixers and tumblers, promising to dissolve trails into static. The noir image of a man counting cash in a smoky backroom did not vanish. It transformed. The same motivations persisted: hide the source, outsmart the system, and keep the empire afloat. But by the dawn of the 21st century, with regulators growing sharper and physical cash growing more burdensome, the stage was set for something entirely new. The next chapter in laundering would not be about bricks and mortar businesses or suitcases at airports. It would be about servers, algorithms, and a kind of invisibility that could never be achieved with paper alone. The accountant never carried a gun. He wore pressed shirts, kept his hair neat, and spent most of his nights with spreadsheets instead of soldiers. To the outside world, he looked like any mid-level office worker, tired from late meetings and long commutes. Yet his job was as essential as the gunmen who guarded convoys. Without him, the empire would suffocate under its own wealth. Money, when left in raw form, became dangerous. Too much cash piled in warehouses made leaders paranoid. Too many couriers caught at airports brought heat from the authorities. His orders from the bosses were clear: make the numbers balance, make the funds flow, and above all, make sure no one could see the stains. For years, he used the same tools his predecessors had: shell companies, restaurants that never closed, false invoices. He managed offshore accounts, sometimes flying to neutral jurisdictions under a false name. But slowly, pressure closed in. Banks that once asked no questions now demanded full documentation. Wire transfers that used to sail across borders triggered automatic alerts. He saw more audits, more frozen accounts, and more colleagues summoned into uncomfortable meetings with investigators. "The world is getting smaller," one of his lawyers muttered after a hearing. Smaller meant harder to hide. The accountant's nightmare wasn't the thought of prison. It was inefficiency. Every day the organization generated more revenue than he could cleanly integrate. Boxes of cash sat unused, waiting for routes that were increasingly unreliable. Risk multiplied with every delay. He needed a system that moved as fast as the business itself. That was when he began hearing whispers about something called Bitcoin. At first, he laughed. The idea of digital coins sounded like a gambler's trick, another casino chip for dreamers and nerds. But the whispers grew louder. He noticed rival groups experimenting, shifting small percentages of their cash into these strange new tokens. He paid attention when one rival organization moved funds across 3 continents without a courier ever boarding a plane. What caught his interest wasn't magic. It was mathematics. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies promised pseudonymity, not true invisibility, but something close enough to confuse casual observers. Wallets were represented by strings of characters, not names. Transactions happened on a public ledger, but the identities behind those addresses were obscured unless linked through external clues. It was not a perfect disguise, but it was cheaper, faster, and less fragile than a human courier sweating through customs with $30,000 strapped to his legs. Speed was another lure. A physical shipment of cash could take weeks to arrange, bribes to pay, drivers to trust, and checkpoints to evade. A digital transfer took minutes, sometimes seconds. Borders, once formidable obstacles, melted away. $1 million could move from Mexico to Eastern Europe in the time it took the accountant to sip his coffee. No planes, no guards, no endless waiting in airport queues. For a man obsessed with efficiency, this was intoxicating. Cross-border movement had always been the hardest part of his job. Domestic laundering, cycling money through local businesses, was manageable, if tedious. But getting value out of one country and into another was the lifeblood of expansion. Drug shipments didn't respect borders, and neither could the money. Traditional bank wires had become hostile terrain, littered with compliance officers and red flags. Crypto offered a new rail system, invisible to customs agents and indifferent to geography. For once, the accountant felt like the technology was working with him rather than against him. Still, he was cautious. He instructed a junior operative to make test runs. Small sums moved into cryptocurrency, then back out into cash. At first, mistakes were made. Keys were lost. Exchanges froze accounts. A few transfers simply vanished. But the accountant saw promise in the trials. Each error was a tuition payment in a new education. By the third month, the system began to hum. Cash collected in the streets was converted into digital tokens. Those tokens leapt borders instantly, sometimes landing in a different continent before the courier who carried the original bills even reached home. From there, tokens were broken down, rerouted, and eventually reemerged as seemingly legitimate capital investments in real estate, stakes in legitimate companies, contributions to community projects that bought goodwill. He knew it wasn't foolproof. He studied reports about law enforcement tracing blockchain transactions, about arrests made when criminals got sloppy. But compared to the vulnerabilities of his old methods, crypto felt like a revelation. It didn't replace everything he still used shell companies and trade invoices when appropriate, but it added a powerful new layer, a hybrid system, flexible and adaptive. The accountant also understood something deeper. Perception mattered as much as mechanics. Bosses who once measured loyalty in cash stacks began to value whoever could explain this new digital world. By mastering the language of wallets and tokens, he positioned himself as indispensable. Younger operatives looked at him like a bridge between eras, a man who could translate the stubborn weight of cash into the weightless flow of code. But with every advantage came a shadow. Crypto's pseudonymity was only skin deep. The accountant feared the trail it left behind, lines of data etched permanently into the blockchain. He knew analysts were out there, building tools to unravel the threads. And unlike cash, which could burn or vanish in a river, digital money never truly disappeared. It lingered, waiting for someone with enough patience to connect the dots. He tried not to think about that when he balanced the books. He focused instead on the bosses who demanded results, on the constant push to move more, faster, cleaner. In their eyes, the question was not whether crypto was safe, but whether it was effective today. Tomorrow's problems could be dealt with tomorrow. His job was to keep the empire breathing in the present. Looking back, the accountant knew he was not unique. Across continents, in other organizations with other languages, men and women just like him were making the same calculations. They were driven not by ideology or fascination with technology, but by pressure. Pressure from stockpiles of cash that risked discovery. Pressure from regulators who grew more sophisticated each year. Pressure from bosses who demanded that the rivers of money flow without interruption. Crypto answered those pressures, at least for a time. The accountant adjusted his tie, looked at the glowing screen in front of him, and watched as another transfer slid silently across a border. It was the same goal, always the same goal. Make dirty money look clean. The tools had changed, but the need remained. And as long as need remained, he knew he would never sleep easily, no matter how efficient his system became. The first thing to understand about this new era is that the old cast of characters never truly left. The street hustler, the accountant, the courier, they all remain. What's changed are their masks, their tools, and the names whispered about them in hushed conversations. If the past looked like smoky back rooms and suitcases filled with cash, the present looks like glowing screens, encrypted chats, and servers humming in the night. But behind the glow, people still play their roles. In this act, we meet four archetypes who keep the machine moving: the operator, the mule, the broker, and the tech fixer. Together they form a new shadow economy, bound by the same logic that has guided laundering for generations. Move the money, hide the origin, and keep the cycle alive. The operator is the conductor of this orchestra. He doesn't touch the street deals or the packages moving through ports. His world is signals, spreadsheets, and networks. From a cramped apartment filled with screens, he orchestrates transfers worth millions. He knows which wallets are hot, already under the eye of blockchain analysts, and which ones are still safe. He times movements like a chess player, waiting for network congestion to hide his steps, splitting large amounts into smaller chunks so they vanish in the noise of thousands of daily transactions. For the operator, the thrill lies in invisibility. He doesn't need to boast, doesn't need to wear the jewelry of old crime bosses. His currency is time and precision. To the outside world, he looks like another remote worker, headphones on, coffee nearby, muttering at a screen. But the flows he directs determine whether bosses sleep easy or wake up to frozen funds. His mistakes ripple through empires. He has no gunman protecting him, only passwords and firewalls. He lives with the knowledge that one miscalculated transfer could collapse a chain of trust built over years. Where the operator controls the digital skies, the mule still walks the ground. Their job hasn't disappeared, just changed form. In the old days, mules carried envelopes across borders or swallowed capsules of cash to sneak through airports. Today, they're more likely to carry USB drives, phones loaded with private keys, or simply cash converted out of digital tokens at an exchange. The mule is the physical anchor in a world of code, the one who touches real currency when others never do. The life of a mule is exhausting and dangerous. They're the ones who must stand in line at banks, who must answer the teller's questions with a steady smile, who must deposit or withdraw sums that skirt thresholds. Some are loyal members of the organization. Others are desperate freelancers, promised quick money if they lend their identities for transactions. They risk becoming the face of the money while those higher up remain invisible. When law enforcement closes in, it is often the mule who falls first, caught holding the bag, literal or digital. Their exhaustion is palpable. Long nights, endless waiting, the weight of suspicion at every checkpoint. Enter the broker, the deal maker in the shadows. The broker is less a technician and more a connector. Their power lies in networks of people, not machines. They know which exchangers will look the other way for a fee, which small-town business owners can integrate cash without asking questions, and which middlemen in online forums will swap tokens for privacy coins at scale. The broker is constantly in motion, always on the phone, always negotiating. To them, money is fluid, always seeking the lowest resistance. The broker speaks 100 dialects of trust. They can convince a weary cashier to process a questionable transaction, then hours later persuade an exchange operator in another country to ignore a suspicious flag. They are the grease in the gears, the person who makes introductions, smooths over disputes, and keeps channels open. In their absence, the machine stalls. The operator may know how to send coins, but without the broker, there's no exit strategy, no way to turn tokens into assets that buy loyalty or power. Finally, there is the tech fixer. Unlike the broker, this figure deals not in people, but in solutions. They are the outsourced genius, the freelancer who sells anonymity as a service. The tech fixer might live thousands of miles away, in a small room cluttered with wires and screens. They write code, set up servers, and configure mixers that shuffle transactions into indecipherable tangles. They know how to leverage privacy coins, how to disguise the fingerprints of blockchain activity, how to spin noise into camouflage. For the tech fixer, loyalty is transactional. They rarely care who their clients are, so long as payment arrives on time, often in crypto itself. Some straddle the line between legitimate cybersecurity and the underworld, selling tools that could be used for privacy activists or for cartels, depending on the buyer. They represent the strange overlap of ideology and commerce, where anti-surveillance activists and money launderers sometimes use the same software for opposite reasons. Together, these four archetypes form the backbone of the new laundering landscape. None can operate alone. The operator needs the mule to bring value back into the physical world. The mule needs the broker to find exchanges willing to take their deposits. The broker needs the tech fixer to offer technological camouflage. And the tech fixer needs the operator to apply their tools strategically. Like gears in a watch, they interlock, their movements small but essential, keeping the hands turning smoothly while the outside world sees only the face. From a distance, it might appear sleek and futuristic. Digital tokens gliding across networks, software tools slicing data into untraceable streams. But the human element remains unchanged. Operators sweat over keyboards. Mules lose sleep over withdrawals. Brokers haggle in back rooms, and tech fixers chase deadlines from behind glowing monitors. Each carries their own risks, their own burden, their own illusions of control. What ties them together is the same old equation: risk versus reward. Every role exists because someone must absorb the risk, and in return they are compensated, sometimes handsomely, sometimes barely enough to justify the danger. The bosses above them rarely appear in these stories. They see only the results: money cleansed, accounts balanced, new ventures funded. For them, the machine is seamless. For the people inside it, the machine is anything but seamless. It is exhausting, precarious, and always one misstep away from collapse. The noir music plays in the background, a reminder that this isn't a story about technology alone. It's a story about people adapting to survive in a changing ecosystem. The operator, the mule, the broker, the tech fixer, they are not legends, not masterminds, just roles in a script that has been running for generations. The props have changed, the stage has shifted, but the drama remains, making dirty money look clean, keeping shadows hidden, and staying one step ahead of those who would turn the spotlight on them. Mixers and tumblers promise a simple service: pool many cryptocurrency inputs, blend them, and return outputs so the original trail is hard to follow. Conceptually, they increase anonymity by adding noise, more transactions, unpredictable timing, and varied output amounts, making direct links between sender and receiver far less obvious. That obfuscation raises legal and ethical questions. Privacy tools can protect dissenters, yet when used to hide criminal proceeds, they enable harm. Debates focus on where privacy ends and facilitation begins, and on how laws should balance civil liberties with stopping illicit finance. Policymakers, technologists, and communities must weigh trade-offs carefully every time. For investigators, the blockchain is both a maze and a map. Every transaction is public, yet buried in oceans of noise. Law enforcement leans on data analytics, subpoenas, and international cooperation to unpick threads, while exchanges face mounting KYCC AML demands, caught between offering privacy and preventing abuse. A well-known case showed this cat and mouse in action. A major mixer was seized, operators arrested, and millions in crypto confiscated. The takedown rippled outward. Customers exposed, exchanges tightening controls, regulators pushing stricter policies. Each move spurs adaptation. Criminals adjust tactics, investigators refine tools, and the cycle repeats, forever testing the balance between freedom and order. Behind the ledgers and servers are people who bear the weight. A courier, jailed for carrying envelopes he barely understood, leaves children waiting at home. A bank clerk, dismissed after unknowingly processing tainted funds, struggles to rebuild her life. In towns where cartel profits fuel endless violence, families live with the echo of gunfire, their futures traded for dirty money cleaned into legitimacy. These aren't abstract flows, but lived consequences: fear, coercion, and broken trust. Every successful transfer carries a hidden cost, etched in lives disrupted, reminding us that laundering isn't just financial. It's deeply, devastatingly human. The future of laundering is a story not of endings, but of constant shifts. For every advance in enforcement, new cracks appear in the wall. For every crackdown on exchanges or mixers, new services sprout up in digital corners harder to reach. To imagine what comes next is to walk a road of speculation, a balancing act between regulation, technology, and the human will to adapt. Regulators today face a paradox. They know that financial crime cannot be eradicated. It can only be contained, managed, and pushed into narrower channels. Yet the very tools they deploy to catch illicit funds often threaten to ensnare ordinary users who simply want privacy. Cryptocurrencies magnify this dilemma. They promise transparency through a public ledger, but also offer obfuscation through mixers, privacy coins, and decentralized exchanges. The question becomes not how do we eliminate laundering, But how do we reduce harm while preserving freedom? One foreseeable change is the intensification of regulatory frameworks worldwide. Already, many countries are tightening rules around exchanges, requiring strict Know Your Customer (KYC) checks, suspicious transaction reports, and transaction monitoring. This is only likely to expand. The Financial Action Task Force, FATF, a global watchdog, has urged countries to enforce the so-called travel rule in crypto, ensuring that sender and recipient information accompanies large transactions. If widely adopted, this would shift crypto closer to the banking system, where every significant transfer leaves a paper or digital trail. But there is tension here. The harder regulators press, the more criminals are pushed toward decentralized platforms beyond the reach of centralized oversight. Peer-to-peer trades, decentralized finance, DeFi protocols, and anonymous swaps create havens where compliance cannot easily be imposed. The paradox deepens. Regulate too tightly, and you drive activity underground. Regulate too loosely, and you invite exploitation. This dance between visibility and evasion is unlikely to end. Technology itself will evolve in unpredictable ways. Blockchain analytics firms have grown into powerful allies for law enforcement, capable of mapping vast networks of transactions, clustering wallets, and linking addresses to real-world actors. Their tools will only grow sharper, machine learning models that spot patterns invisible to the human eye, automated alerts for suspicious flows, cross-chain monitoring to follow funds as they hop between blockchains. Yet technology is a double-edged sword. As forensic tools advance, so too will obfuscation techniques, privacy-enhancing technologies, zero-knowledge proofs, ring signatures, stealth addresses are being developed for reasons that range from activism to commerce. Criminals will undoubtedly adopt them, just as they adopted mixers and tumblers in the early days. This arms race raises profound ethical questions. Is privacy an inherent right, or is it a luxury that must be curtailed in the face of criminal abuse? Civil liberties advocates argue that mass surveillance of financial flows risks creating an Orwellian system where every purchase is tracked. They remind us that not only criminals need privacy, so do journalists, whistleblowers, and citizens in authoritarian states. On the other hand, law enforcement warns that without visibility, the fight against terrorism financing, drug cartels, and human trafficking is severely weakened. This is the knife's edge on which the future balances. Another trend to watch is international cooperation, or its absence. Crime crosses borders effortlessly, but regulation often stops at the water's edge. A cartel accountant can move funds from Latin America to Europe in seconds, but prosecutors in those same jurisdictions may spend months arguing over jurisdiction and evidence sharing. If the global community cannot harmonize laws and processes, criminals will continue to exploit gaps. Some progress has been made with cross-border task forces and joint operations leading to seizures of illicit exchanges and marketplaces. But full cooperation is hindered by politics, differing priorities, and competing visions of what financial freedom should mean. The next decade may well test whether countries can set aside those differences to face a common threat. Meanwhile, the human element remains as unpredictable as ever. Technology and regulation matter, but adaptation is always driven by people. For every operator caught, another learns from his mistake. For every mule arrested, a new recruit steps in, desperate enough to take the risk. Brokers find new contacts. Tech fixers write new code. The resilience of the system lies in its decentralization. Cut one thread, and others remain intact. This resilience is what makes the laundering game so difficult to end. Looking further ahead, one can imagine scenarios where artificial intelligence plays a central role. Algorithms may scan global transaction flows in real time, flagging anomalies faster than any human team. But equally, AI may empower criminals, creating automated laundering systems that adapt to enforcement in seconds, finding loopholes faster than regulators can close them. The battlefield could become one of machines versus machines, with human lives caught in the consequences. The uncertainty is what looms largest. No one can predict the next wave with certainty. Perhaps new regulations will choke off illicit channels more effectively than skeptics believe. Perhaps a technological breakthrough in privacy will render tracing efforts obsolete. Perhaps geopolitical crises will reshape priorities, pushing some governments to embrace anonymity in defiance of others. What is clear is that the struggle will not end. It will only change form. And in this uncertainty lies the responsibility to act wisely. Policymakers must resist the temptation of blunt force solutions that criminalize privacy wholesale. Technologists must recognize that tools designed for liberation can also be twisted for exploitation. International bodies must push for frameworks that are adaptable, not rigid, allowing for nuance as the landscape evolves. Above all, societies must remember the human cost. The couriers, the clerks, the communities whose lives are shaped by flows of money they will never see. As the credits roll on today's chapter, the question lingers. What changes next? The answer is not a single breakthrough, not a final takedown, not an end to laundering. It is a continuous process, a cat and mouse chase written across ledgers and lives. The tools will evolve, the tactics will shift, but the story remains the same, a struggle to control the shadows of money and to decide how much light the future will allow to shine upon them. Different rails, same hunger, and the people who pay the price are rarely the ones at the top. The story of laundering, whether through mules in airports or mixers on the blockchain, is less about clever tricks and more about consequences. Families torn apart, communities destabilized, institutions corroded by shadows of money. As we close, remember, this isn't just a tale of crime and code. It's a mirror of the pressures shaping our world. Stay curious, but stay responsible. Seek out trusted journalism. Support organizations helping victims of financial crime and cartel violence. Learn about digital privacy with care, understanding both its power and its risks. Because in the end, the fight isn't only about stopping the flow of dirty money. It's about choosing what kind of world we want that money to shape.